heard it a million times, right? The devil is in the details. We all say it. But what if I told you that for centuries, we've been getting its meaning completely, maybe even fundamentally, wrong? What if it's not actually a warning, but a symptom? A symptom of a much bigger problem? Well, let's get into it.
All right, so first things first, let's just lock in what we all think this phrase means. Because, its everyday use is what sets the stage for a pretty surprising twist.
So we use this phrase to point out that even when a big plan seems solid, whether you're throwing a party or, hey, even starting a social revolution, the real problems, the devil, is hiding in those tiny little specifics. It's like, imagine your party is a total flop because you accidentally sat two cousins who hate each other at the same table. The big idea was great, but one tiny overlooked detail just wrecked the whole thing.
And that question, well, that's really the heart of what we're digging into today. Because this one little question cracks open a really fascinating history and a huge shift in how we think about, why we do the things we do.
All right, let's get to the big reveal. This is where things start to get really interesting. Because it turns out, the original saying is pretty much the exact opposite of how we use it now.
So, long before the devil showed up in the details, the original phrase was actually God is in the detail. I mean, it seems like a tiny change, right? Just one word. But that one word swap represents a massive, massive shift in meaning and our whole mindset.
See, the original meaning wasn't a warning at all. It wasn't about looking out for hidden problems. It was an aspiration. It was all about the idea that to create something truly great, something, worthy of the divine, you had to pour meticulous, painstaking care into every single tiny element. It's all about that drive for perfection, but for a reason bigger than yourself. So you have to ask, why the change? Why did we kick God out of the details and let the devil move in? Well, this was no accident. It wasn't just a slip of the tongue that caught on. It actually points to a really deep philosophical shift in what makes us tick. And here's the argument from the source material. The focus basically shifted away from doing things for some higher purpose, some selfless ideal, and it moved toward doing things for ourselves, for our own ego. And believe me, the second your personal ego gets in the driver's seat, the whole game changes.
And this really lays out the two competing mindsets perfectly. Think about it. If you're coming from a place of selfless service and someone points out a mistake in the details, you're probably going to say, oh, thanks for catching that, because the main goal is making it perfect. But if your ego is what's driving you, that exact same correction feels like a personal attack, right? It feels like someone is challenging you, challenging your authority.
So let's take a look at what happens in the real world when ego gets tangled up in the details of a so-called noble idea. Because this isn't just some philosophical debate. It has had absolutely devastating consequences throughout history. And this is such a powerful point. The argument is that big, noble goals, things like social justice or spiritual enlightenment, they don't usually fail because the ideas themselves are bad. No, they fail in the execution. They fall apart when the people in charge, the managers, are driven by their own egos, their own greed, their own flaws. And sadly, history is just littered with examples of this. I mean, just look at the centuries of religious conflict. So often, these really noble spiritual goals were twisted to justify absolutely horrific violence and naked power grabs. The human cost, it's just staggering. It's almost impossible to really wrap your head around. Let's just look at the numbers. During the Crusades, all in the name of reclaiming the Holy Land, estimates say that anywhere from 1 to 9 million people were killed.
And that was just one period. Then you have the French Wars of Religion, which added another 2 to 4 million lives to the total. This was a brutal struggle for control between Catholics and Protestants.
And then, the 30 Years' War, which was one of the most destructive conflicts in all of human history. Another 4.5 to 8 million people perished. And we have to remember, these aren't just numbers on a screen. We're talking about entire generations just wiped out, all because the details of leadership got corrupted by ego.
Because when you strip away all the fancy speeches and the complex justifications, what do you find? You find the real motives, raw ambition, greed for land and money, and just a pure lust for power. The noble spiritual goals, they just became a very convenient cover story.
A perfect case study is King Henry VIII. His public reason for breaking with the Catholic Church was this noble-sounding idea that the Church was making his people poor. But what was the real reason? The Pope wouldn't grant him an annulment for his marriage. That's it. One purely selfish motive that completely upended the religious history of an entire nation. Okay,
So, if history is just full of leaders using these super complex arguments to hide their selfish motives, how is a regular person supposed to see through all that noise? How do you tell what's real?
Well, here's the thing. The source material argues that you don't need some fancy degree in theology or political science to figure it out. The tool for cutting through all that confusion is actually something incredibly simple, something we all know.
It really just comes down to a foundational moral code. The Ten Commandments are a great example of this, what the source calls an infallible yardstick. The whole argument is that if you just measure a leader's actions against these really basic principles, don't murder, don't steal, don't lie, you can slice right through all the confusing talk and see the true motivation, which is often just plain selfish.
All right, so this whole discussion finally brings the focus back to us. Because this isn't just a story about flawed leaders. It's also about the responsibility that lies with the people who choose to follow them. And this is such a critical point. When followers get so focused on the big, noble goal that they start to ignore the shady actions or the flawed character of their leaders, well, the ultimate loss becomes theirs. They end up losing the very thing they were fighting for in the first place. And this connects directly to the world we live in right now. That feeling of cynicism, of apathy that's so common today, that loss of faith in big, noble causes, the source argues that you can trace it right back to this repeating pattern. People getting let down over and over by flawed leaders whose bad behavior was never called out by the people following them.
So we're going to end with this question, and it really turns this whole thing into a personal challenge for all of us. Are you focused on the noble goal, or are you paying attention to the details of how we get there? Because it's so easy to get swept up in a grand vision. But maybe we should remember the original meaning that God, or whatever higher principle you believe in, is truly in the details. And the morality of the journey matters every bit as much as the nobility of the destination.